My name is Marin Osi. I am 34 years old. And the morning my mother stood up at my promotion ceremony, the one I had worked 11 years to reach, and told my director that she had made me possible. I had been sending money home every single month for 8 years. Not sometimes, not when I could, every month, without a single missed transfer, without a single thank you. I want you to hold that for a second. Not the money, the thank you. Because this isn't a story about money. It's a story about what people do when they realize that love, real love, the kind that crosses water and starts over with nothing, can be weaponized. Slowly, quietly, with perfect plausible deniability because the weapon is the love itself. 312 transfers. That's what I counted one night in March at 1:17 in the morning, when I finally opened every bank statement I had ever filed away and did the math I had been refusing to do for most of my adult life. 312. Each one between $40 and $200, depending on the month, depending on the emergency, depending on which relative had a bill that couldn't wait, a surgery that couldn't be postponed, a school fee that was somehow always due before the end of the week. My name is Marin Osi. I am a structural civil engineer. And what I did with those 312 transfer receipts, they did not expect. If this is your first time on this channel, I want you to subscribe right now because the story I'm about to tell you is not one I tell lightly, and I'm only telling it once. And let me take you back to before the ocean. My parents, Kofi and Adwoa Ose, left Ghana in 1989 with one suitcase between them, $300 in a white envelope, and the address of a cousin in Minneapolis who had said, more or less, "Come, we'll figure it out." My mother was 26. My father was 29. They did not have jobs. They did not have English strong enough to carry them through a job interview. What they had was each other, the cousin's pull-out couch, and a belief. The specific, unironic belief of a certain generation of immigrants that sacrifice made today would compound into something extraordinary for the children they hadn't had yet. I was born 2 years later. My brother, Kwame, 3 years after me. We were the investment. I want to be precise about that because it took me years to understand it clearly. My parents did not love us like children. They loved us like a portfolio. Every meal, every overtime shift, every birthday gift they bought on layaway and pretended to afford was a transaction, an entry in a ledger. And the ledger would be settled when we were grown and earning, and the returns would come home. They were not cruel. That is the thing you have to understand first, or the rest of this story doesn't work. They were not cruel people. My father worked double shifts at a printing company for 16 years. My mother cleaned offices downtown from 4 in the morning until noon, then came home and made soup from scratch and helped me with homework in a language that was still, after a decade, not fully hers. They did not beat us. They did not neglect us. In every external way, we were loved. The story I'm telling you lives in the gap between external love and the thing underneath it. I want to tell you one specific memory, just one, because you need to understand who my father was before he became the man who called my husband a charity project. I was 9 years old. It was the winter science fair at my elementary school, and I had built a model bridge out of popsicle sticks and glue, and I was devastated by it because it looked terrible and I knew it. And I had told my mother I didn't want to go. She made me go anyway. And I stood there in the gymnasium in my wool sweater, next to my embarrassing popsicle bridge, and I watched the other kids' projects, the volcano, the solar system made of spray-painted styrofoam, and I felt the specific misery of being 9 and underprepared. My father was there. He had taken the afternoon off work, something he never did, and he stood next to that popsicle bridge, and he looked at it the way you look at something you have decided to love on principle. He asked me how it worked. He asked me to explain the load distribution. He listened like it was the most interesting thing he had heard in years. He asked the judge to explain his scoring rubric. He did this not because he thought I would win. I didn't win. He did it because he wanted me to see that someone took what I made seriously, that my work was worth defending. That is the father who was in the gymnasium that afternoon. I do not know exactly when the ledger replaced him. I only know that by the time I was in university, the ledger was all there was. By the time I was 22 and had accepted my first real engineering position, entry level, a city infrastructure firm in Chicago, my mother had already begun what I can now recognize as the campaign. It was never one conversation. It was never a direct demand. It was a climate. The way a climate works, gradually, pervasively, and by the time you notice it, you've been breathing it so long it feels like the air itself. The first transfer I sent home was $400. My mother had called on a Tuesday in October to tell me that my father's blood pressure medication had changed. The new prescription cost more, and they were short that month. I was making $31,000 a year before taxes. I sent the $400. I didn't think about it hard. He was my father. It was blood pressure medication. What kind of person doesn't send $400 for their father's medication? The second transfer came 6 weeks later, a cousin's school fee. $300. I knew the cousin vaguely. She was the daughter of my mother's sister, a girl I had met once at a family funeral when I was 13. My mother explained that the school would turn her away without the fee and that our family had agreed to help and that everyone was contributing. I sent the $300. The third time was my aunt's rent, not an emergency, not a crisis, a gap, just until next month. $60, then $80, then $120 for something I can no longer remember. I want to be a structural engineer about this for a moment because that is how my mind works. And if you're going to understand the full weight of what was happening, you need to understand the mechanics of it. A structure doesn't fail all at once. That is a common misconception, that collapse is sudden, that it comes without warning. What actually happens is load transfer. Stress migrates from the compromise point to the next nearest one, and the next, and the next, until the load is distributed so broadly across a structure that the structure no longer knows what it was built to carry, because it has been carrying something else for so long. I was 22. I was the structure. The load was never going to stop migrating. The warning signs were there. I see them clearly now. At the time, I did what you do. I explained them away. The first sign: my brother Kwame never sent money. In 8 years, in 140 conversations about family obligations and what we owed and what it meant to have been given the opportunities we had been given, Kwame's name never appeared on a transfer. He had a job, he had a salary, he was, by our parents' accounting, still finding his footing. He was 28 years old for 4 consecutive years by my mother's reckoning, I noticed. I told myself it was because he was the baby. I told myself he contributed in other ways in the ways I couldn't see because I was far away in Chicago. I told myself a lot of things that all amounted to the same thing. I talked myself out of noticing. The second sign: when I got my engineering license, the professional engineer certification, the credential I had studied for across 2 years while working full-time, my mother's response on the phone was, "Good. Does mean a raise?" I remember standing in my kitchen holding the certificate and thinking, there is supposed to be a different response to this. There is supposed to be something other than a question about what it means for the ledger. I thought it for about 40 seconds. Then I told myself she was just excited for me, just awkward about it, just not used to knowing how to celebrate this particular kind of achievement. I talked myself out of that one too. The third sign: when I met Darius, my husband, my parents met him once, at a dinner I had arranged with extraordinary care, and my father shook his hand and said, formally and without warmth, "So you are the man who is taking our investment." Darius laughed like it was a joke. My mother changed the subject. I spent the drive home explaining to Darius why my father had meant it affectionately, and why the word investment was a term of endearment in our family's private language. And I said it with enough conviction that I think I even believed it. I was 27 at the time. I had been an engineer for 3 years. I had already sent home, by conservative estimate, somewhere around $19,000. And I was in a car explaining to the man I loved that being called our investment was a compliment. That is what the climate does. It makes the weather feel normal. Now, I need to tell you about the promotion. I had been working toward the position of senior project engineer at my firm for 4 years. This is not a dramatic way of saying I wanted a title. I mean that I had taken on 2 bridge rehabilitation projects that were under-resourced and overscheduled, had brought both in with intolerance and on budget, had managed 4 junior engineers and a permitting process that involved 3 municipalities and a federal review board, and had done all of this while being the only Black woman on my team and exactly one of 2 women in my division. I had done this with the specific, measured efficiency of someone who understands that their margin for error is smaller than it should be. My director, a man named Douglas Hale, who is not the villain of this story, and I want to be clear about that, had told me in January that the promotion was mine pending the spring review board. In April, he confirmed it. The ceremony, a small one, a firm luncheon with the partners and project managers, was scheduled for the third Friday in May. My mother asked if she could attend. I said yes. I said it without hesitation, and I want you to understand why. Because the 9-year-old girl standing next to the popsicle bridge had never fully gone away. Some part of me still wanted the moment. Wanted the version of my parents who had driven to the gymnasium and stood there and listened to me explain load distribution like it was worth understanding. I wanted to give her the chance to be that again. She flew in from Minneapolis on Thursday evening. I picked her up, I made dinner. I showed her the apartment Darius and I had just bought. She asked if the mortgage was manageable. I told her it was fine. She said she had heard the Minneapolis housing market was struggling and that she and my father were thinking about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere cheaper. Maybe, but only if things settled down financially. I did not ask what financially meant. I knew what it meant. Friday morning, I woke up and dressed in the suit I had bought specifically for this occasion. Charcoal gray, well-fitted, the kind of suit that takes structural engineering seriously. I drove to the firm with my mother in the passenger seat, and I walked her to the event room on the 14th floor, and I introduced her to Douglas Hale with the simple sentence, "This is my mother. She flew in for today." Douglas shook her hand warmly. He said, "You must be very proud." My mother smiled. Then she said, "And I want you to hear every word of this, because every word matters." She said, "I am. We sacrificed everything for her. Without us, none of this would be possible. She owes us everything she has." Douglas kept the smile on his face the way trained professionals keep smiles on their faces when something has happened that they are processing in real time. He said, "What a wonderful family." He moved away to greet another guest. I stood there. The room smelled like catered food and cut flowers, and the specific climate-controlled air of a corporate 14th floor that costs more per square foot than most people's apartments. I was wearing the charcoal suit. I had a glass of sparkling water in my hand. My mother was standing next to me, still smiling, already scanning the room for the next person to talk to. I held myself the way a load-bearing structure holds itself after someone has just walked through and removed 3 bolts. Upright, functioning, carrying. I did not say what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say was, "You flew here, that is true. You sacrificed, that is true. But I have been sending you money for 8 years, and I have never once heard you say to a room full of people that you are proud of what I built. I have only ever heard you say what I owe." What I said instead was nothing. I took a breath. I walked to the podium when my name was called. I accepted the plaque. I gave a 40-second thank you speech that I had practiced, that was professional and precise, and said exactly what it needed to say. And somewhere inside me, a door that had been stuck for years gave a small, quiet click. I want to tell you something honest about the weeks that followed, because this is where I almost went back. Darius just knew something had shifted. He didn't push. He has the particular intelligence of someone who knows when to give a room space to breathe. He made coffee in the mornings, and he didn't ask questions, and he left the light on in the office when I stayed up late staring at nothing, and all of that was its own kind of love, the quiet kind, the kind you don't put on a ledger. But there were nights. There was one specific night, a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the ceremony, when I was sitting in the kitchen at 2:09 in the morning, with my mother's number already in my hand. I had typed 6 of the 10 digits. I was thinking about calling her, not to fight, to fix it, to say, "I know things got strange. I know the ceremony was uncomfortable. Let's talk. Let's reset. Let's find the version of this where we're okay." I sat there with 6 digits typed for a long time. I knew how the call would go. I have been an engineer for 11 years, and one thing engineering teaches you is this: you cannot model a structure with false inputs and expect an accurate result. If you know, empirically, from evidence, from data, that the material will behave a certain way under stress, then your prediction must account for that behavior. You do not get to substitute the material you wish you had. I knew how the call would go because I had made versions of that call before. She would cry, I would feel guilty. By the end of the conversation, I would be apologizing for something I had not done. And by morning, I would have promised something else. Another transfer, another visit, another season of carrying something that was never going to be put down. I put the phone face down on the counter. I sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. Darius found me there at some point and didn't say anything, just sat down across from me with his own glass of water. And we sat there in the quiet together until I felt the kitchen become a room again instead of a decision. I did not call. And it was in that kitchen, in that dark, with those 6 undialed digits, that I finally understood the exact difference between loving someone and funding them. Here is what my mother did not know about me. In 2019, as part of a city bridge rehabilitation project, I had developed a modified inspection protocol for post-tensioned concrete bridge decks. It was a technical process, a specific sequence for evaluating section loss in prestressed tendons that reduced inspection time by 31% while maintaining a higher accuracy threshold than the standard AASHTO method. My firm had applied for a patent on the protocol in 2020. It was granted in 2021. I was the primary inventor on the patent. That patent had over 3 years of licensing to municipal infrastructure departments in 4 states, earned a modest but accumulating royalty stream. By May of that year, it had generated approximately $61,000 in licensing fees that had been quietly depositing into an account I had opened specifically for this purpose. An account I had told no one about, including Darius, until the night in the kitchen when I finally explained all of it to him over cold coffee. My mother did not know about the patent. She did not know about the account. She had no idea that the daughter she had described in front of Douglas Hale as an investment she owned had spent 5 years quietly building the kind of intellectual property that generates value without anyone's permission. That is not what she needed to know yet. What I needed to figure out was what to do with what I had. I want to stop here and ask you something, because this moment, right before the calculation, is the moment I keep coming back to. Have you ever done the math on something you knew on some level was going to change everything the moment the numbers landed? I mean, really sat down and added it all up, the years, the dollars, the specific cost of every time you said yes when your gut said ask why first. Drop yes or still a ding in the comments. I'll be reading everyone, because what I found when I finally did the math was something I wasn't prepared for. And now I need to tell you what I decided. 312 transfers. I sat with every bank statement I had ever saved. I am an engineer. I save things. And I opened a spreadsheet and I entered every single one. This took 4 hours. By the end, I had to total 41 due over 8 years. To my parents, to my aunt, to cousins I barely knew, to a funeral fund for a great uncle I had met twice, to a car repair for my mother's neighbor who was like family. $41,200. Sent in transfers between $40 and $200, so small they never felt like anything. The climate had been perfect, no single storm. Just $41,000 of consistent, reasonable-seeming weather. That number sat in my chest like a measurement. Not with anger. Anger would come later. Right now it was just data, a load calculation. And the load calculation told me that the structure had been carrying approximately twice what it was designed for approximately 8 years, and that nobody had ever run the numbers because the person bearing the load had been too busy bearing it to count. I was not going to pay it back to myself. That was not the point. The money was gone and I had sent it freely, and I was not going to spend my life grieving it. What I was going to do was stop. Not in a phone call, not in a fight, not in a confrontation designed to extract an apology I was never going to get. Quietly, professionally. With the same measured calm I use when I'm closing out a project, document everything, notify the relevant parties, and redirect. The first step was the simplest. I set up a new transfer protocol. The automatic monthly transfer, $180, set up in 2018 and never canceled, was canceled. I did this on a Tuesday morning before work. It took 4 minutes. I did not send a message explaining it. I just stopped. The second step was my own. My professional engineer license, that stamp, that credential, was the thing my firm used on every municipal permit application, every structural certification, every document that required a licensed engineer's seal of approval on the projects I oversaw. 3 of those projects were currently in active permitting, involving county infrastructure departments, state review boards, and federal highway program funds. My name, my license, my stamp was on all of them. I requested a leave of absence, not a resignation, a leave. 30 days beginning in 2 weeks, citing personal health reasons. My director was surprised. He was also, because Douglas Hale is a decent man, concerned. He asked if I was all right. I told him I needed some time. He approved it without asking more. What that leave meant was simple. The 3 active projects I was stamping could not advance without a licensed PE of record. They could bring in a consultant. They could reassign. But any reassignment would require weeks of review, would delay the permitting timeline, would trigger cost overruns on projects that were already running close to schedule. This was not sabotage. Every document I left behind was complete, accurate, and professional. I left notes, I left files, I left everything a colleague would need to continue. What I left was a pause. A professional, legal, documented pause, and in that pause was a question: what is this work worth when the person who has been doing it quietly for 11 years simply steps back? The first call came on a Thursday, 11 days after I canceled the transfer. My mother. She opened warm. She asked about Darius, about the apartment, about a neighbor of mine she had met at the ceremony. All the warmth of someone who is about to ask for something and is warming up the room first. I recognized the rhythm. I had been hearing it for 34 years. After about 4 minutes, she said, "We've had a small situation with the car. Your father's, the one he uses for the dialysis appointments, the alternator went." I said, "I'm sorry to hear that. It's about 300. I was thinking, since you had the promotion and things are going well. Mom, I said, "I've stopped the automatic transfer." Silence. What do you mean? I mean, I closed the transfer. I'm not sending money home anymore. More silence. And then the pivot that I knew was coming, that I had run the model on in my head, that I had prepared for the way you prepare for a known load. She said, "Marin, your father is sick. Do you understand what I'm telling you? His dialysis. If we can't get him to his appointments, Dad's health is between him and his doctor," I said. "Not me and my bank account. How can you say that? After everything." "After everything," I repeated, not as a question, just as an acknowledgement that the sentence existed. She said, "I gave up everything for you. Everything. Do you know what I had, what I left behind so that you could stand in that room with that plaque? Do you?" "You did," I said. "You gave up a great deal. I know that. And I have been grateful for it every single day. I've also been transferring money home for 8 years to demonstrate that gratitude. 312 times. But gratitude isn't a payment plan with no end date. I love you. I'm not sending money." She hung up. I put the phone down and went back to the structural inspection report I'd been reviewing. My hands were steady, not because I was cold, because I had run this calculation before. I knew what the load was. I had finally stopped pretending I could carry more than the structure was designed for. The second call came from my Aunt Emma, my mother's older sister, a woman I had always liked, whose orbit I had been folded into without asking because she was family, and in our family the radius of obligation had no visible boundary. She called on a Saturday. She said my mother was devastated. She said my father didn't understand. She said the community was asking questions because apparently my mother had been telling people, the church, the neighborhood association, the extended diaspora network that functions as its own ecosystem of reputation and gossip, that I was the one who took care of things, and now things were no longer being taken care of. And people had noticed. I asked my aunt, "Did you know that in 8 years, not once did either of my parents tell anyone I was sending money? Not the church, not the community, not the cousins whose school fees I was paying. The only version they told was the one where they made me." My aunt was quiet. "I'm not angry about that anymore," I said. "I'm just done being a resource that doesn't get acknowledged." She said she understood. She said she needed time to process. She did not ask for money. I think somewhere in her she had always known the math. She just hadn't been the one doing it. Hazongirl is. My father's email came last. It arrived on a Sunday night, 2 weeks after my mother's first call. It was 3 paragraphs. His English in text has always been more careful than his English in conversation, more deliberate, like he is packing each sentence for a long trip. He said, "I have not always known how to show you what you mean to me. I know you built things I did not help build. I know your mother and I confused the sacrifice we made with the credit we were owed. These are not the same thing. I was a coward about it for many years. I am sorry." He said, You do not owe us your life. We chose to come here. We chose to have you. You did not owe us a return on a decision we made for ourselves," he said. The man in the gymnasium that day who asked the judge about the scoring rubric, he is still here. He just got very lost for a very long time. I read it 5 times. It didn't fix anything. It didn't reopen the transfer or erase 34 full my years of climbed or give me back the $41,000 or the ceremony that should have been mine. It didn't fix my mother, who still, to this day, has not called back. It mattered anyway. There is a woman named Ruth Boateng who has been my mother's closest friend since 1994. She is not dramatic, Ruth. She speaks in the particular, measured way of someone who has lived long enough to have learned the difference between accuracy and cruelty, and who chooses accuracy every time. Ruth called my mother's church coordinator, a woman named Betta, who runs the community committee and whose opinion is the only currency in that community that actually moves markets. And she said, without drama, without embellishment, the following: "I think you should know that for 8 years, Marin Osi has been sending money home every month. She paid for 3 school fees, 2 car repairs, 1 medical emergency, and her father's medication adjustment out of her own engineer's salary, while no one told a single person she was doing it. The story you've been hearing about the family that made the daughter is half of the story. The other half is the daughter who kept the family going without being asked. Bet, who knows everything that happens in every household in a 7-block radius, had what you might call a quiet revelation. By the following Sunday, the conversation at my parents' church had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Communities like theirs do not stage scenes. They simply adjust the temperature of things. My mother, I was told by Ruth, had stopped attending the Saturday morning women's gathering she had attended for 11 years. She had not been asked to leave. She had simply felt the room change around her. That is the only currency that had ever actually mattered to her. And now it was the thing she could not buy back with someone else's transfers. I want to stop here and ask you one more thing. There is a moment in this story where I had $41,000 worth of evidence, a patent that had quietly earned $61,000 more, and a mother standing in front of my director telling him she made me. And I had a choice about what to do with all of it. If you were standing in that exact moment, the charcoal suit, the plaque, the smile frozen on Douglas Hale's face, what would you have done? Walked away, or said something in the comments? I am genuinely asking. Because what I did was neither of those things, and I think it was right, and I want to tell you why. What I did was simpler than either option. I asked for a meeting with Douglas Hale, not to report my mother, not to perform a grievance, to have a professional conversation about my future at the firm. I told him, in general terms, that I had been carrying a significant family financial obligation for several years, and that I was in the process of addressing it. I told him I had taken the leave to reorganize some personal priorities, and that I was planning to return. I told him about the patent. He knew about the patent. Of course he did. It was a firm-sponsored patent, and the royalties ran through the firm's IP licensing arm. What he didn't know was that I had been using my share of those royalties to build a reserve. What he didn't know was that I had been quietly researching, for about a year, what it would take to open my own inspection consultancy, niche, specialized, the kind that only requires one licensed PE and a solid reputation to generate a sustainable income. I told him that too. Douglas Hale looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "How long would you need?" I told him 18 months. He said, "I'd like to keep you. I'd also like to not lose you badly if we can't keep you." What would keep you? What we worked out over the following 3 weeks was an arrangement that I will not detail in full because the specifics are still being lived. What I will tell you is that it involved a senior title, a project lead designation on a new state infrastructure initiative, and a formal acknowledgement in my contract that my PE stamp was a value that the firm recognized explicitly, not implied, stated. I signed it on a Tuesday. I slept through the night for the first time in 4 months. 6 months later, this is where things stand. I am senior project engineer and PE of record on a $22 million bridge rehabilitation project in northern Illinois. The project is mine in a way that my previous work was never quite mine. My name is on the design documents, my license is the certification of record, my methodology is the one that will carry the structure. Engineers who will work on Illinois bridges 20 years from now will work with methods that originated and regimented in my inspection protocol. That is not nothing. That is the opposite of nothing. Darius and I did not take a vacation last year because I was saving every month. This year, we are going to Portugal. I have booked the flights. My mother has not called. I have thought about this more than I have thought about almost anything else in the last 6 months. I have decided that I am leaving the door open about 1 inch, in the way you leave a door open when you want air but not entry. If she comes, she will have to come with something different than she has ever brought before. Not money. Not an accounting of sacrifice. Something smaller and harder. The admission that the investment was always a person. I don't know if she has it in her. I hope she does. My father called on my birthday. He said happy birthday. He asked how Darius was. He asked about the bridge project in the careful, non-expert way of someone who wants to know about your work without knowing enough to ask the right questions. I told him about the load specifications. He listened. He asked if the bridge was a good one. I said I thought so. I said I thought it would stand for a long time. He said, good. You build good things. That was the whole call. It was 6 minutes and 40 seconds long. I know because I sat with the phone in my hand after he hung up and the timer was still running. It didn't repair 34 years. It wasn't supposed to. It was a man who had gotten very lost, finally finding one correct direction. I am still an engineer. I still use load calculations to understand things. The calculation I keep running now is not the one about the transfers. It is the one about my own structure. For 8 years, I carried a load that was never mine. I carried it because I loved the people who asked me to carry it. I carried it because I had been told, since before I had the language to question the logic, that their sacrifice was a weight I owed them forever in return. I never ran the calculation on what that was doing to me. I was too busy carrying. When I finally stopped and measured the deflection, the amount the structure had been bending under load it wasn't designed for, the number was sobering, not just in dollars. In decisions unmade, opportunities deferred, a marriage that had almost buckled under the weight of a secret that wasn't mine to keep, of a phone ringing at midnight with an emergency that was never actually mine to solve. A structure that has been overloaded for long enough will carry the marks of it forever. The steel remembers. I am not going to tell you I walked away from this without marks. I didn't. There are things about the way I receive love that I am still working on. A reflex to look for the ask inside the kindness, a habit of waiting for the ledger to appear. I am aware of this. I am working on it in the quiet, methodical way I work on things. But here is what I know. The bridge in northern Illinois will stand for 50 years, maybe longer. The methodology encoded in my inspection protocol will run through 100 projects I will never personally see. The patent will earn money while I sleep. None of those things required my parents' approval. None of them were diminished by my mother's performance at that ceremony. None of them belonged to anyone but me. I built them. That is the thing no one can take because no one gave it to me. If you are the one who has been sending the transfers, the one in the family who is always the one, whose number gets dialed first, whose yes is assumed before the question is finished, maybe it's time to do the math. Not to punish yourself, not to collect a debt, but because the number matters, because you deserve to know what the structure has been carrying. Not because love is a ledger, but because you are not a resource, you are a person. And the people who love you should know the difference. Sacrifice is not a cage, but it can be made into one. And the key when you find it is very quiet. It does not make a sound. It just opens. I want to hear from you. Drop pay or Bandari in the comments, one word, that's all, and tell me which one you've been living in. I read every comment, everyone. If this story reached something in you, please share it. Not for the channel, for the person in your life who is currently carrying something they haven't yet counted. Next week, I'll be sharing the story of a man who found out, after 30 years, that the family business he'd been working in for free had a silent partner, and the silent partner was him. You're not going to want to miss it. My name is Marin Osi. I'm a structural engineer, and I know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative one. So do you.